go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go.
And here we are. Hello. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Containers from the Couch. So it has been, it's been a few weeks since we've been on. You know, summer break has definitely ravaged everyone's schedules. But we have a really cool show today. So as you can see, we have a special guest, Dan, who's going to introduce himself in just a moment. But today we're going to talk about App2Container. And I'm going to let Dan talk about how we're going to get from a Java application running on a server somewhere to App Runner. And I'll give you a hint, App2Container is in the mix here. So Dan, why don't you do a quick introduction? Tell us, you know, who you are and why you're so awesome. And then let's dive into it.
Cool. Yeah. I'm Dan Scholl. I'm a senior SDE on the App2Container team. Been here for about a year. And I recently built this App Runner integration. So yeah, that's just quickly about me. But yeah, just to go for people that don't know very much about App2Container, like Adam said, it's basically it's there to help customers containerize their existing applications that might be running on an on-prem server or a virtual machine anywhere. The idea is like you don't even necessarily have to have source code, and App2Container will help you containerize your application. And then it doesn't stop there. After that, it'll help you create a deployment to run that container in AWS. So we have 3 different types of deployments we support for AWS. We already supported ECS and EKS, and now with the recent App Runner launch, we also support App Runner for Linux applications. And then for Windows applications, since App Runner doesn't yet support Windows, we do support Windows application deployments to ECS and EKS. But
so can we talk about that for a minute? I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. So if I have, and this is very common, especially in migration scenarios, right? We're in the data center. We've had this app running for the past, 15 years. No one knows who wrote it. That engineer is long gone. We don't know where the source code is. So you're telling me with App2Container, I don't need source code. App2Container can help me take that code that's running on a server, that application, and actually containerize it and run it in a production-ready environment?
Exactly, yeah. So App2Container, you don't even really have to know very much about your application. There are like, we don't support every application type under the sun, but especially on Linux, we support Java applications with extra careful handling for Tomcat and JBoss. But yeah, that's the way it works. You just run App2Container and it kind of like discovers the things that are needed in order to lift and shift to a container. So it's a nice way to just kind of like move off your legacy stuff without having to really involve developers. Like it could be a DevOps person, that isn't that familiar with the software that they're moving. And so that's kind of one of the big benefits of it.
That's pretty awesome, and that's a great use case right there. Is someone who's kind of the DevOps operations folks leading the migration. Sometimes there's apps that are just there. Like I said, you don't know who's managing them anymore. So, and they may not be Java experts, but this tool is going to help us get that Java code into a container in AWS. That's super cool.
Yeah, and the way it works is like it's a one of those opinionated approaches where you don't really have to make any decisions along the way. App2Container kind of decides things for you, but at the same time, it has configurability. So if you want to override those like defaults that are chosen, you can. And so we'll show a little bit of that in the demo here. But yeah, that's the nice thing about it is you don't have to know very much about containers, about AWS. You just can kind of like follow the steps of running this tool, and you'll lift and shift to App Runner in this case.
Fantastic. And again, just to reiterate, the languages supported right now are, you said Java?
Yeah, so on Linux, we support Java, and specifically the frameworks that we have the best support for are like web apps that are running in Tomcat or JBoss, because there's a lot of enterprise customers that use those frameworks. And then for Windows, we're actually more focused on .NET applications, specifically .NET Framework applications running in IIS. So that's also like a really common framework for enterprise customers for Windows. So that's kind of like, for now, we're focusing on these like common use cases and really focusing on honing the implementation for those.
Makes sense. Yeah, let's get right into it. This is amazing.
Okay. Yeah, so this picture here just kind of shows the various pieces that we're going to interact with in this demo. The top right in the gray box here is kind of representing the legacy application deployment. In this case, I am using this Beanstalk deployment. It's another AWS service that some customers might be using. And so Beanstalk also helps you create an environment for you to run your application. But the difference with Beanstalk is that the resources are contained within your own AWS account. So you'll see all these EC2 instances and load balancers and things like that. And so the nice thing about App Runner, of course, is that the App Runner service team maintains all that stuff for you. So you have like less infrastructure to manage. So yeah, that's the existing application. It's the Snakes application that's talking to a Postgres database. Real quick, I can just show an example. Like this is the Elastic Beanstalk application. It's just a website for people that either love or hate snakes. There's a list of movies if you want to find out if a certain movie has snakes or not. This is reading from that database to get that information. So that's the existing application. Very high-tech stuff.
And so this environment right now, we just happen to deploy it in Elastic Beanstalk, but realistically in a customer use case, this could represent a data center. You have a virtual machine or a server running in your data center talking to a database there.
Yeah, exactly. It's Linux, pretty much anything that you're running Linux. So the App2Container, you can like download it and install it and run it wherever, pretty much.
Awesome.
So yeah, then the end goal, of course, is that App Runner deployment where we're going to be running the same thing, but within containers that App Runner is scaling. And so then the other box up here in the top left, this is where we're going to run App2Container. And so App2Container has, it's really pretty flexible as to how you want to operate. Maybe the simplest way would actually be to install App2Container on the instance where the web application is running. And so you can do that. You can install Docker and App2Container and run everything from there. But for the demo today, I wanted to show our remote functionality where you can install App2Container on a different machine. Idea being that this machine is just like a transient thing. So it's really, you don't have to worry about your existing infrastructure. You can just spin up this machine, probably like an EC2 instance or something, install Docker on there, and then install App2Container. And then you configure it with some SSH keys so that it can use SSH to talk to your application server. So that's where we're going to run App2Container. And then these other boxes are like basically the other AWS pieces that we're going to be working with. So we're going to store the SSH key for that connection in Secrets Manager. We're going to push the container image to AWS ECR, the Elastic Container Registry. And that's where App Runner will basically read directly from that ECR repository to get the container image that we're creating. And then we're going to use CloudFormation to, App2Container will build the CloudFormation templates that will spin up your App Runner service along with the role that App Runner needs in order to read from the ECR repository. So
nice. So basically this it's going to take everything it learns. It's going to put it into CloudFormation. So if we want to reproduce this environment multiple times, we could, right?
Yeah. So the extra nice thing about the CloudFormation templates that we create are there's even more chances for you to like add in configurations, or maybe if you're familiar with CloudFormation, you could add in some other resources that you want to create, like maybe a new database or something. So it's kind of like a starting point. Like this will get you working, but you can add to that over time.
Cool. And some questions are coming in.
Okay.
Around the RDS instance, and I have a feeling I know where this is going, but so the tech guy had asked, is the RDS deployed in a private subnet? My guess would be, actually, go ahead.
Yeah, it does. So that's like I think the number one requested feature for App Runner is to support that, and so it's not there yet. So right now, in order for this setup to work, the database has to allow inbound connections from the external internet, and so I had to configure my security group for the VPC that this database is in to allow those inbound connections. So yeah, I'm not surprised that question came up either. I see that on the App Runner channel all the time. But yeah, my understanding is that the team is working on that right now. So yeah, once that's there, then you can configure App Runner to be able to talk to things within your VPC. But
yeah, and so App Runner does have a roadmap. I'll share the link in the chat. So if this is something you're looking for and you haven't already seen the roadmap, go there, find the issue, +1 it. So let's move on. We're good.
Right. Okay, so yeah, that's just overall what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to demo the App2Container commands to like discover the applications on here, extract the necessary files, and create a container, and then create this deployment. So kind of jump into it. First thing I'm going to do is create the secrets manager key so that so the App2Container can access my Elastic Beanstalk instance. So I just have this SSH key called A2C snakes. So I'm just going to base64 encode that because that's the format that we need to be stored in Secrets Manager. And then I create this JSON body that just has the username, which is EC2 user, and the key, which is that base64 key, and store it in this temporary JSON file. And then I'm going to name it something new because I've created a few of these already. So that's basically just using the AWS Secrets Manager CLI to create a Secrets Manager instance within the US West 2 region, which is where I'm going to put my App Runner deployment and run App2Container and everything. And so the main thing I need from this is this ARN. So this is the resource name the App2Container will use to go and read that secret. So now that we have that there, we can go, this is on, sorry, this terminal is the worker machine where I've done some of the setup already. So on this worker machine, I've already installed Docker, and I have App2Container there, but I'm going to go ahead and show running installation of that. And I also have the AWS CLI. So if I, just to kind of verify my AWS CLI setup, I configured the default profile to talk to my account. So I can just like list my S3 buckets, and that just kind of confirms for me that my AWS CLI is set up correctly. And then to verify that my Docker is set up correctly, I can just run Docker images, and okay, I see right now I have one image there already. So Docker and the AWS CLI are running, and those are really the prerequisites the App2Container needs to do its job. So
nice. And by the way, I always do that too when I want to check like my AWS CLI access. I always run AWS S3LS. That's like my command is what level of access do I have? What profile am I using? So that's
great. I'm glad I'm not the only one that I came from like an object storage background, so that's why this is convenient for me. But it's also, I think, the least number of characters to type to confirm anything. So
I think that's why. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we verified our setup. Yeah, like I said, I'll go ahead and install App2Container. So in here, I've saved off the installer. You can download it if you search for the App2Container documentation. There's links to the installer in there. But when you untar it, there's a install.sh script. There's a you accept the terms sort of thing. The install is pretty quick. It's just saving off some of the resources that might be used for the various deployments. And then it goes ahead and suggests like the next thing you should do is run init. So we're going to do that to initialize App2Container. And there's just a few interactive questions it's going to ask you. The first thing here is like, where's a workspace on this local machine where we can store artifacts? So this is where we're going to store like the extracted tar files that are going to be needed to create the container image and CloudFormation templates and things like that. So it's kind of suggesting some defaults because I've already run through this on this machine, so it like remembers what my answers were before. But this is where I wanted to store my workspace. And then here it's asking me, do I want to use the EC2 instance profile that's tied to this instance where I'm running? Because it detected that there's already like a profile there. And so it's able to use that. But in this case, I wanted to actually use the default profile that I configured for my AWS CLI. So I'm going to say no to that. I think my terminal is maybe hiding some things. Sorry about that. So then the next question is like, okay, you don't want to use the instance profile. Well, what AWS profile do you want to use? And the default is default because I've already, default is like the name of the profile. And so that's actually the one I want to use. So I'll go ahead and accept that. And then App2Container also would like to have a bucket to store some artifacts. So for some of the deployment types, we store like some of the sub CloudFormation templates inside of S3. And so this is the bucket that those will get stored in. This is like within your own account. And then do you want to report metrics? And would you be okay with uploading logs in the case of errors? And would you like to restrict to only allowing images that are signed by Docker Content Trust? So if that's important to you, you can hit yes there, but we'll go ahead and say no. And so now App2Container is like kind of initialized and ready to go. So the next step is one more initialization type thing where we need to tell App2Container how to get to our remote server. So there's a remote configure command for that. And
I'm sorry, Dan, quick question that I just thought of here. So as I'm going through this from a permissions perspective, for IAM, do we have any recommended policies? Should I be doing this as an admin user most likely?
So if you look in the App2Container documentation, there are some more scoped down policies you can use. Sorry about that. But yeah, I mean, admin is the simplest thing, especially if it's a test account. So you don't have to scope down those policies. But yeah, there is some guidance in the documentation.
Cool. Good to know.
Yeah. So yeah, we need to give it an IP address. So from my MacBook, I'm just gonna like use the Elastic Beanstalk SSH command to just remember what the IP address is for my device. So there it is. And then you can either put the IP address or the fully qualified domain name. You don't need both. So the authentication method to be used for connecting to that is for Linux, we support SSH key authentication or certificate-based auth. So if you have certificate-based authentication, like maybe you're in a more lockdown environment, then you can use that. For now, we're just going to use the key-based auth. And then here's where we need the secret ARN that we created earlier. So copy that from here.
Nice.
Okay, and so behind the scenes, you can't really tell, but after the fact that it didn't error out there tells me that like it was able to read that secret using the profile that the AWS that you configured earlier, and it was able to connect to that server. So now we know, okay, everything is good to go. Like App2Container is able to talk to our application server. And if we wanted to configure more, we could do that, but we'll say no for now. Okay, so now we're kind of past the initial setup stages, and we can do what App2Container first needs to do, which is to inventory the running applications on your server. So now we're going to use this remote inventory command and specify the target IP address that we just configured. And so with these remote commands, App2Container SSHs into the remote box, and it kind of does like a minimal installation of just what's necessary to do this analysis stuff. And then it collects the files, downloads them, and cleans up after itself. So it's kind of like just like swoops in, gets the information, and comes back out. So you don't have to like leave a bunch of files around on that application server. So the output of that command is this inventory.json file. And so in the case of my server, I just have this one application that it detected. And so you can see it does like some initial high-level analysis, like the process ID is this. This is like an abbreviation of the command line, and we can see that it detected that it was a Tomcat application. So that's all good. And kind of the next thing we want to do now is analyze that application that we discovered there. So this we'll do a deeper dive to gather information, to gather metadata needed to create the container image. And so after this step, App2Container kind of gives some suggestions about what to do next. The first thing is to take a look at this analysis.json file. So this is kind of the interface App2Container has. Like from one step to the next, we create a JSON file with like defaults that will work for the next step, but also will allow you to override certain things. So we'll just take a look at that file. So we can see this section here. Container parameters, there's a few things you can override as far as the containerization goes. So having run through this before, I'm going to actually add something to this app-specific file. So there's these two things. They kind of allow you to like override the logic that decides what files need to be brought into the container. So if, let's say you like did one run through and you found that like it brought more files than were needed or was missing some files, this is like an easy way you can tell App2Container like, hey, I want this specific file. So what I'm going to add in here is this var app current, which is something that the Tomcat, this is basically where my Tomcat web content is stored. And normally App2Container would find that, but with Elastic Beanstalk, it turns out that it makes use of a bunch of symlinks. And so I just kind of discovered this recently. There's basically some room for improvement for App2Container to kind of follow the symlinks better. So that's something we're going to be fixing in a a release that's coming out soon. But for now, you can easily like make sure to bring in those files by just adding this here.
Nice. So we kind of build this template, you know, with our opinion built in as to how we think this should be, you know, built and deployed. If you go in there, you see something that you know is specific to your environment, or you want to override something, you can here as well. That's really nice.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So, and then down here is more like the metadata I was talking about that's going to describe what App2Container needs to know about creating the container. So you don't really need to understand this stuff, but just to get an idea for what it's saving, like, you know, the details of the command line for that running process, and some information about the operating system, the ports that are open for that process is listening to, Java properties, environment variables, stuff like that.
Yeah, environment variables. I mean, this really introspects that application and gives you all the details you need to run it. This is super cool.
Yeah. So that's the cool thing, like we were talking about earlier, is like you don't even really have to talk to developers or anything. Like you can App2Container like digs in and finds out what's there without you needing to do any of that.
That's awesome.
Okay, so we've got the analysis.json modified as we need, and then we can go ahead and run this remote extract command. I'll just go ahead and kick it off. And so this is like the last step of talking to the application server. So we're SSHing in and making use of that analysis.json metadata to decide like what files do we need to save from that server. And we pack all that stuff into this tar file that App2Container will later use to build the container image. So now that that's done, we can run the containerize step, and we can basically just copy paste this here. And so with this, we're telling it, go ahead and containerize with this specific archive.
So, I mean, this is a pretty guided experience. Like, it feels to me like I don't really need to reference the documentation all that much. If I just, you know, I install this tool, I start running, it's going to walk me through the steps I need to take to get this going.
Yeah, that's really what we're going for. You know, the documentation is there as a reference, but we, you know, as a developer myself, I almost never start with reading the documentation when I'm using a new tool. So I'm guessing other people are similar to that. So yeah, just like discoverability of the features within the CLI outputs itself, that's what we're going for. And we're trying to keep it lean for now. That's why we don't have a UI or anything. You know, like the CLI allows us to keep things simple. And given that it's targeted at like DevOps and DevOps type people or developers, like you know, the CLI experience probably isn't too much of a turnoff. But yeah, we give those like helpful next step type things to kind of guide you through, like you were saying.
Nice.
So yeah, for containerization, we can see the various steps that it went through. It did some like prerequisite checks with Docker, and it was able to extract the input archive. It generated an entry file, which those that are already familiar with containers might know what that's about. But that's basically it's basically like the script that's going to be run when the container boots up. So that's like what starts the process. And then there's a Docker file that is created here, and then it uses that Docker file to build the image. So we can go ahead and look at the Docker file. We can see it's using the Amazon Linux base image. My Elastic Beanstalk EC2 instance was also running Amazon Linux. So it kind of detected that, and it's, you know, just as like an effort to preserve as much as possible for the best chance of success, it just uses that same base image. So if it was a Ubuntu image, it would have chosen Ubuntu.
Nice.
So it's basically like installing the tools that are necessary to run the application and setting up environment variables and exposing ports. And it's not like a super lengthy Docker file, but the nice thing is that like you don't really have to understand how Docker works or how to construct a Docker file. Like that's all done for you there. So if I run Docker images, I can see now this Java Tomcat image has been created locally. It was just created about a minute ago. And so one thing we can do is, we would, before we try to like deploy this to the cloud, since we have an image here, we should be able to test it, do a quick kick the tires test to make sure the container looks good. So we can, somewhere here in the output, we can look at the images, and then here we go. So with the Docker run command, you can give it a name of the container. The -p parameter is going to tell it to expose any ports that are open. And then we can give it the image name there. So we'll get some standard out here. There's, unfortunately with this image right now, I think maybe related to that symlink thing, there's some scary looking messages about logs, but the container is functional. And again, that's like something we're going to work to improve. But if I open up another terminal, what's this guy? So this is another terminal on that same worker machine. If I run Docker PS, I can see that my container is running and it's forwarding these ports. So I want to see what's on the 8080 port. And so the local port 49177 is going to forward to 8080. So if I just hit curl on that, we can see the HTML for the snakes page. If I just search for snakes, you or loved one hate snakes. So that's kind of the content we were looking for. It's just like I said, a quick kick the tires test. So we're confident now that there's like a web application running inside of that container.
Nice.
So just to like clean things up, we can remove that container, and we're now ready to move on to the next step. If I just scroll back up to the standard out here, we can see after testing the container, it's suggesting now that we look at this deployment.json file. So again, this is the output of the containerization step and the input to the next step. So if I look at that, so basically there's again like some defaults here. It's talking about the ports that are exposed, and the main thing to understand here is that there's a section for ECS and a section for EKS and a section for App Runner. So by default right now, App2Container always just kind of suggests ECS because it's like a general purpose thing that will work for most customers. But you can easily turn off the ECS deployment by setting this to false. And then if we go down to the App Runner section, we can turn on the App Runner deployment creation.
And did you say, could I theoretically deploy to all three, or is it just is it like only one?
One at a time, yeah. You could come back and do another one later, but it doesn't do like a fan out deployment right now or anything. Yeah. Cool. And so there's some default, like a CloudFormation stack name. Maybe we can change this to something more human readable if we want. The service name is the name of the service within App Runner. Sorry, let me just close this. So yeah, those defaults were fine, but just for clarity, we can change them. And then the main thing that's really configurable here is this auto deployments enabled. So people that are familiar with App Runner might know what this is, but App Runner has this really nice feature to help you with CI/CD, where if you set this to true, all you have to do to update your App Runner deployment is push a new image to the Elastic Container Registry. And so then it'll automatically it'll upgrade your existing containers with the new version. So we'll go ahead and leave that as true. And then if you want to, you can add some tags that'll be applied to the resources in the stack.
Nice. And another benefit of App Runner is the auto scaling's built in, right? You get a lot of this functionality just out of the box. There was a question earlier, what's the difference between Elastic Beanstalk and App Runner? And just, I look at it like Elastic Beanstalk there's there's a lot of different options. It's more of like an automation type tool, right? It can build auto scaling groups. It can help me build my databases. Whereas App Runner is, here's a container, or here's my code, and I just want it to run. I want everything else abstracted from me, and I want App Runner to figure out how to scale, in and out as needed, and so on. So I think App Runner is definitely much more opinionated and abstracts everything away, and everything's managed. You don't see those resources in your account. You just see, here's my code, or here's my Docker image. App Runner, take care of the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the beauty of App Runner, is just like less stuff for you to maintain. You don't have to worry about keeping your host images up to date. You're running EC2 instances or anything. It's just all taken care of.
And so there was, sorry, Dan, really quick, there was a question that came in. So is from the tech guy, is Fargate deployment possible? So when we deploy to ECS, is Fargate the compute we use?
Yes. So for Linux, Fargate is the compute that we use. For Windows, it's EC2, but that's sort of, Windows doesn't yet support Fargate, but that's probably something that's coming soon, and App2Container will support it whenever that happens. So yeah, and then App Runner, of course, is built on top of Fargate too. So you're kind of like benefiting from that same technology, but it's like abstracted from you. You don't even necessarily care about it.
Exactly.
Okay. Were there other questions you said, or should we keep going?
Well, so there was a question. Just someone likes your terminal setup. So maybe at the end, if there's time, you can talk about what you're using and if you're using Tmux and how all that works.
Sure. Yeah. So now that we've configured our deployment.json, we can go ahead and do the next step, which is to create the CloudFormation templates that will represent this new blue box here. So the output of the previous command told us how to do that. We can generate app deployment with this application ID. And so now we're going to, so here's where we actually start talking to AWS. So even though we're actually just creating CloudFormation templates, we're also going to push your container image from this local worker machine into ECR, the Elastic Container Registry, so that your container image will then be living in the cloud and can be read by App Runner once we do that deployment. So we can see here that I've run through this demo once before on this machine and with this application. So I already had that repository there, but it'll update the repository with the image that I just created. And so after that, yeah, we can see it pushed the image, and then it generated the CloudFormation template here. And so now App2Container is telling us, okay, you're all set to use CloudFormation to manage your application stack. So the next step that you would take is use the CloudFormation CLI to deploy that template that we just created. Also, though, there's a -- deploy parameter that we could have run, and the way that works is basically App2Container will just do this CloudFormation deployment for you, and then it'll kind of pull and wait for that to finish, and then tell you when it's all done. The deployment takes 15 minutes or so. So just to save time for this demo today, I'm gonna show the templates that were generated, and then we can kind of go look at a live running deployment that was created earlier. So again, this is the CloudFormation template that App2Container generates, and you don't really have to understand it, but if you wanted to take a peek to see what's in there and possibly to override certain things like the CPU and memory settings, you can override those here. And then you can see that the resources that are included in the stack are just two things. There's this ECR access role. So this is a role that's going to allow App Runner to read from your ECR repository. So that's part of the stack. And then the other thing is the App Runner service itself. And you can see here, fits on this whole screen. It's there's almost nothing to it at all. You just, you just have to tell it where is the ECR repository that your container images live, and then what are the instance settings like CPU and memory. What's the role it should use, and what are some tags? If you wanted to, so we automatically put in this A to C generated tag, so you can see pretty easily what are the things that App2Container created for me based on those tags. So App Runner does have other settings you can set also. This isn't all of the CloudFormation settings. So if you wanted to go to the App Runner and CloudFormation documentation, you could find other things that you could override there. But the defaults work out pretty well. So that's what we provide. So yeah, I'll go ahead and jump to my web browser where I can look at running at CloudFormation. Sorry, let me just log in here.
You know, I think about this from whether you're a beginner or an expert, you know, in AWS and whatever you're doing. I think App2Container helps you to just move fast. It gives you these artifacts that if you just don't have the time to build these artifacts on your own, the CloudFormation, the Docker file, you know, having to understand the application, just take it as is. You can learn from reading the CloudFormation, the Docker file to understand how everything works. And then as you need to build on that, you can, because it's CloudFormation at the end of the day. It's a Docker file at the end of the day. It's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Funny thing is, when I started a year ago, I was pretty new to everything AWS, new to containers, new to everything. And so, you know, as a new engineer, I just like started using App2Container to, you know, ramp up on the team. And yeah, I was surprised by how little I had to learn to get like a running deployed stack. It was like, what? It's already done? I don't understand any of this stuff. And so afterwards, I could kind of, just like you said, go back and look at the artifacts and then kind of gain some understanding. Because it especially helps when it's like tying to your own application. So, you know, you have like some knowledge about your application and you can see how like, oh, it used this for my application to create the stack. And I don't know, it just really helps piece things together. So yeah, from one aspect, it's almost like a helpful learning tool. But yeah, the nice thing is it's just like a lift and shift without having to fully understand everything that's happening.
Yeah, really. The lift, you as the user is doing very little lift. App2Container does all the lift for you.
Yeah, totally.
So very cool.
So if I go to CloudFormation, I can see the stack that I deployed earlier.
And if you can maybe zoom in just a little bit.
Yeah.
Couple notches. Oh, that's good too.
Okay. Maybe one less. So if I look at the stacks within that, or the resources within that stack, there's just the two, which we saw in the template. There's the App Runner service and the ECR role. So then I can go over to the App Runner console to get a closer look at that service that was created. So we can see here, right from this page, you can see a link to our running web application. So we can see it's running at apprunner.com. It's the same web application. And if I go to the Browse Movies page, I can see, you know, it's telling me which movies have snakes and which don't, which tells me that it's talking to the database correctly.
By the way, there were environment variables. So out of curiosity, what did App2Container do with those environment variables?
Yeah, it put them into the Docker file. So it saw that it detected the environment variables on the Elastic Beanstalk instance, and those had the database connection information. So it put them into the Docker file. Yeah.
Cool. Very good.
Yeah, so I don't know if we need to dig into the App Runner console anymore. Like maybe people are familiar with that, but you can see
it's good. Let's do it.
Okay. Yeah, it's sort of like, it's a nice like high level simple console. Like you can see recent activity about like deployments that were done, you know, with updated container images. You can look at, there's like various logs. There's like these high level event logs about deployments that have been started and you know, their status. And then the nice thing is the application logs. This will look familiar because we saw that running container. When we ran the container locally, this is basically the same thing we saw in standard out. So you can see like the standard out of your containers there. And there's also like some high level configuration you could change. Given that we created this with CloudFormation, like ideally you would make your configuration change with the CloudFormation template and then publish an update. But you could make like temporary config changes to test things out on the service here. And then
you see auto scaling. If you could just go back. So again, we talked about kind of what one of the differences between Elastic Beanstalk, App Runner. App Runner, just out of the box, I get these things, right? Like auto scaling is there, health checks are there, as well as logging. So having that insight into the logging, it's just all there. It's in one place, really easy to just get to and get that insight into your application immediately.
Yeah, totally.
So sorry, go on. I just got excited.
It's okay. Auto scaling is very exciting. And then, yeah, like some high level metrics, like request counts and 400, 500, that's, latency. It's just like high level health check type things that are nice to like have without doing any work at all. And then there is a configuration page for custom domains. So our domain that was created automatically, it's like this blah, blah, blah App Runner thing. It's not, so if you had your own like DNS name that you wanted to use, you could add that here. And so App Runner makes that pretty easy too. So yeah, that's like the deployment that we create. There is one more feature from App2Container that I'll show that's like an optional after thing. And then if there's any other questions, we can jump to those. So I think the step 3 here that was suggested after the end of the deployment is to generate a pipeline. And so the pipeline that we create here is a like CI/CD pipeline that customers can use to, if they did have source code and they wanted to have a pipeline that would go from source code straight to their deployment, this kind of helps you with that. So I'll just kind of show in CloudFormation again, like the pipeline, an example pipeline that gets generated there, so we get an idea for what is it exactly that it's creating for us.
And is that pipeline is that basically a pipeline that's just going to deploy CloudFormation for us?
No, actually. So it's more depending on the existing stack that was already created. So what we see here is like 2 different CloudFormation stacks, one for App Runner, for the App Runner deployment that we've been talking about, and one for the pipeline stack. And so the pipeline stack, its output is the ECR repository that we created before. So nice. it doesn't do the CloudFormation deployment, but that is a neat idea. So within the pipeline stack, maybe I'm zoomed in a little too much to like see what this is. There's some substacks. There's a bunch of roles that are needed to do the various operations, and then there's a substack for the pipeline itself. And if we look at this, the resources over here, we can see it created like a build project and a bucket for artifacts and an event rule, which will configure the project to get kicked off when an update to the code commit repository happens. So if I look at the code pipeline, that autocomplete worked pretty well despite my...
That was pretty good.
Yeah.
That was good.
Awesome. Yeah, so we can see this is the pipeline. If I click on it, you kind of get like a visual of the components. So the input is code commit. This is just a Git repository that has... so for the Git repository, you can either provide one where you already have your source code, or App2Container can create one for you. And the main things that App2Container adds to it are this Docker file and a build spec. And so it's going to use those things inside of the second piece, which is the code build job. So this is where you can configure build steps, where you can like build your application and then create an updated container image and push that updated container image to ECR. So if we look at the build spec, all of this stuff, this pretty much all came from App2Container. The only thing I added was /build.sh. So for this Snakes app, you just kick off that build script and it'll create a new war file. But then after that, it's doing a Docker build and doing the Docker push. And so if we look at the Docker file that's here, the Docker build is of course going to make use of this Docker file. And this one is like a really simplified thing. So the idea is like you don't even have to mess with the original Docker file, because this is like built on top of the existing image and it adds a layer on top of it. So yeah, in this case, I just needed to like copy root.war into that location, and then that'll like deploy the latest application. So yeah, that's kind of the pipeline, and that's pretty much everything I wanted to show. Wow.
I mean, so I guess, we should probably do a recap, because a lot happened with, I would say, little work, so to speak. Not little work for you who actually built App2Container, but for the folks using it, yes. So you started with, you had an application running. It was a Java app running in Elastic Beanstalk, but really this could have been in your data center running on a virtual machine. This application, this Tomcat app's running using App2Container, making sure I understand. Using App2Container, you're able to remote into that instance, that virtual machine. App2Container was able to figure out what applications were running on that server. You then decided this is the application I want to migrate. App2Container was able to go back into that host, get all the configuration needed, the code, everything it needs. It built a Docker image. You said it built the configuration. Then you said I want to deploy this to App Runner, and then it took care of the rest.
Yeah.
I kind of, probably missed some things there, but.
Well, the took care of the rest part, just to fill that in a little bit more, it creates the CloudFormation templates, which is an interesting thing because I would say in the case of App Runner, you don't even really need CloudFormation because it's like, the template we generate only has those two things. But because App2Container is built on top of CloudFormation in general, like for ECS and EKS, the CloudFormation templates we create are a little more complicated. That they have more infrastructure inside of them. So to keep the design the same and the interface the same, we create that CloudFormation template. And so, some customers might like that because they can build on top of the CloudFormation. Other customers might prefer, like, just give me the running App Runner service and then I'll just interact with that directly. So either way, I feel like both of those use cases are met. So yeah, it creates that CloudFormation, which you can then use to talk to CloudFormation to create the deployment. And then your app is running in App Runner with all the benefits that brings.
And it's a good point you made. I think that the CloudFormation, it helps to just provide a good practice as to how you should think about managing your resources in AWS. Doesn't mean you have to do it this way. And if this is just one simple app, managing in the App Runner console works very well too. So you have the options there, but at least at the end of this, you have two artifacts, one that describes your environment and one that describes your application in a Docker file. So I mean, that's a lot of work that someone would have to do on their own that's managed for them. And then, of course, it deploys it and gives them a fully running environment. So really amazing with all the opinion built in, all the automation that's kind of built in there, too. There were a couple questions I wanted to run through, and they were kind of like App Runner specific. So one was from the tech guy, is the ALB created by App Runner? So App Runner actually doesn't use application load balancing behind the scenes. It actually uses App Mesh. There's a different components behind the scenes, but that's all managed, and you don't have to think about that. But I wanted to add to that. There was the question earlier about, you were running this database. Were you running it in a private or public, subnet? How is that exposed? So if you had a requirement where you had to keep that database in a private subnet, you couldn't use App Runner to talk to it. This is where then you could go the next step where you could use ECS, right? And then I could configure that. Does that make sense, Dan?
Yeah. And with our ECS and EKS deployments, we have the ability to make use of an existing VPC that's already in your account. So if you already have a database inside of a VPC, you can tell App2Container, hey, put my new stack inside of that VPC. And so that's how that can work. So whenever App Runner whenever the functionality for App Runner catches up in a similar fashion, I'm sure we'll modify App2Container to allow you to do that as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And so for those who need those internal VPC resources, maybe you have a direct connect that connects back to the data center, whatever it is, then ECS or EKS, using one of those options with App2Container, are going to help you solve that problem.
Yep.
Let's see here. And then, so there was a question from the tech guy also about, can you explain how auto-scaling of EC2 gets triggered? So the beauty of App Runner is there is no EC2 involved here, at least from your perspective as the user, and it's actually running on a Fargate task behind the scenes. So really, the auto-scaling is application auto-scaling, and it's request-based. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Dan?
No, I was thinking about bringing up the auto-scaling configuration for App Runner, because that is another thing that you can specify as your auto-scaling configuration. Like, there's some configurability there, but I'm not an expert on that. I think sounds like you covered it more than I would be able to. So
cool. Yeah. So that's as far as I know what's supported now. But of course, as we grow App Runner, more options for auto scaling will be available, I'm sure. But it's all based off of customer feedback and so on. So let's see. I think that's about it. I just want to do a quick scan to see if there's any other questions. Yep, Fargate we talked about. Yeah, so I think we touched on everything. This was a really cool demo. Oh, there's a question. Are we going to use the CDK? So here today, no.
Right.
But I guess as far as the CDK, because App Runner is supported in CloudFormation, technically you could use CDK to deploy that. But are there any plans to support CDK with App2Container at all?
I mean, it's definitely something that we've thought about, and given enough customer demand, I think we would do that. So it's not on the immediate roadmap as far as I know right now, but yeah, I think that's the sort of thing with enough demand, we would definitely do that. There's nothing keeping us from doing that.
Cool. So if that's something you're looking for, reach out. I don't know if there's a public roadmap for App2Container.
Yeah, I don't think there is. Sorry.
Okay, so no, so just reach out if you have a solutions architect or like a TAM, a technical account manager you work with. Reach out to them. If you don't, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Also, Dan has a Twitter handle I see too. Reach out to us. Let us. Is that your Twitter handle? Did I
Actually,
get that right?
No. I thought that was your. I don't know why. I thought that was my Amazon handle.
I'd say Amazon handle too. That works too. But feel free to reach out to us. And we're glad to talk through what you're looking at and submit that to the team. So I think we are good here. The code is in GitHub. Let me post that here. Right. So there's a couple things. One, there's a blog that walks through exactly what you walked through, right, Dan?
Pretty much, yeah, very similar.
So that's here. I just posted the blog, and then the application is here on the AWS samples repo and GitHub. So if you want to have this snakes application, you could run this too. It cracks me up. My older daughter is terrified of snakes, so I'm gonna show her this app so she can have her comfort knowing that these movies don't have snakes in them.
Yep.
So, all right, let's see. Oh, perfect. So if you could reach out to, I don't know, is that true, Dan? Just making sure I didn't.
Yeah.
Oh,
that looks right. App2Container support. Oh, at gmail.com. That's.
I don't know if that's true, and I may have just posted something. So I don't know. So you know what? I'm going to say on that one, I just don't know who that is. So don't reach out there. Okay. Reach out to me on Twitter. And if you have a question on how to reach out to the team, I will get you the email address. So otherwise, thank you, everybody, for sticking around and watching us. If you have any questions, please do reach out on Twitter. But Dan, thanks so much. That was a super cool demo. And we will be back soon with more content. So thanks, everybody, and keep in touch.
Thanks for having me.